The circumstances around our leaving Ponca Indian Church and going to Hammon Indian Mission, we had come down to the end of the summer and had taken vacation and gone to visit our folks. We were still at Ponca City, and we needed that couple of weeks of vacation that we took, and spent time with Deloris's folks at Buffalo and my folks in Mineola, and of course that time we had our Barb and Fred and Joel also, and on our way back we were talking about trying to make plans as to what we would do and how things would go together for the next year as we were trying to minister there at Ponca City. And we got home and picked up our mail, and we had a letter from Bailey Sewell, the Home Mission Board, that we had been appointed as missionaries to Hammon, Oklahoma, to the Cheyenne Indians. And it immediately I got a hold of Bailey, and he said, "We've been trying to get a hold of you." The Home Mission Board, Executive Board, had to meet. It'd be 3 more months before they could, and they needed to meet and offer you the opportunity of going to Hammon among the Cheyennes. And I said, well, I was very strongly opposed to it, and I told him, I said, this is not God's will. And he said, well, would you go over with me and meet the people and see what's going on, and then pray about it and see. He said the board just needed to take action, and we felt like that you might be the man for the field there. And so I finally agreed to go. But when I left that morning to meet Bailey Sewell and go on over, Deloris and I both were very much opposed to it. And I told her, I said, you pray, and I said, I'm going to pray about it. But I said, this is just not God's will for our lives. And so I met Bailey, and we drove the last 7,500 miles on into Hammon, and it was the strangest thing. We topped a hill, and where you could see Hammon half mile away, and it was the strangest feeling. I felt like I was home, and I just couldn't believe that it would change so quick. And but we went by the building site, and if you ever talk about I talk about Hammon as being our honeymoon church, but if a preacher ever got something laid in his lap, they were just in the middle of a building program, just started it. All the money was raised. All of the volunteer labor was lined up. Albert Flint, a deacon in the First Baptist Church there in Hammon, was in charge of the construction, and everything was taken care of. All they needed to do is just go in and start pastoring and start building a church. It was all taken care of. And so we met Lori and John Flick, who was a white farm family that was members of the First Baptist Church, and we met a few of the Indian people, and or I did. And so we made arrangements that in about a week we would come out and I would preach in view of a call, and Bailey and I went back on our way back toward home, and I just felt a perfect peace that this was exactly what God wanted. And when I got back home, I asked Deloris, and she said, "I think we're going." And I feel like this is that this is where God wants us. And so we went out in another week. We went out and preached and met some of the people, and they were meeting out at the old campground where they used to live, kind of in tar paper houses and stuff like that, in a community building out there. And I preached out there that night, and you talk about a house full. There must have been 125 people there, Native American people. And so I was introduced, and of course the family was there, and Deloris and Barb Fridden and Joel were sitting on the front row, and so I got up and I was preaching, and I was into my sermon pretty good, and Fred needed to go to the bathroom, so he went outside and was gone for just a little bit. And he came back in, and he had a duck, a wild duck, that he had caught out in the front of the church or the community building. He had it around its body to where it had its wings tucked down. And that old duck's head was just jerking back and forth. And here he comes with this great big smile on his face right down the aisle. Well, of course, I saw him as soon as he started. And I just stopped preaching. And he'd come by a pew of people, and they started snickering. And the further he came, they started snickering, and there was about 10 rows of people, 10 or 12. And he came down and walked over to his mother, and of course here's this duck, and she gets out. And so he took it back outside and turned it loose, and the sermon was over. I mean, there was no way you could bring that back. And so I closed out. And do you know, those people got out there, and they looked and looked and looked and looked for that duck, for that little boy, and never could find it. Now, apparently, there was moonlight, and apparently it had tried to land on a car top, and it kind of stunned itself a little bit. Mm-hmm. And so Fred broke that sermon up real quick. And but you know, they gave us a unanimous call. And we went back to Ponca and resigned, and moved and come to Hammon, and we did not know it for a while. We joined the church, and by letter, and do you know, there was so much anger and resentment toward us back there at Ponca City, they would not grant a letter to us. And wow. Finally, Bailey Sewell, who was the director of home mission work, Indian work in Oklahoma, said, "You guys might as well just join by a statement, because they're not going to to issue it. So that was the end of that. But we moved to Hammon. Barbara would have been a first grader that first year, and we were there for 8 years and 6 months, and it would be in Hammon that our last son, Lawrence, was born, and the beginning of a ministry that just was an unbelievable thing. There were 2 Indian churches in Hammon. There was, 1,200, 1,500 people that lived there. They were both Indian and white, and there was separate churches. There was the First Baptist Church. There was the Indian Mission. It's hard to get really a starting place in what happened at how things come about in Hammon and how the work progressed. But we moved in and began to live in a place that was about a block from where the new building was being built. And this building was 100 feet long and 32 feet wide. It was built out of concrete block. And Albert Flint, the deacon, became very close. He and I just exceptionally close together over those years. And he was a rancher, but he was also a groceryman. He had a grocery store, and he and I spent an awful lot of time together. We worked on that building with volunteer labor. Roger Mills Baptist Association, or Becca Mills Baptist Association, was the association, and they financed the majority of the materials and cost, and the different churches sent volunteer labor to help build it. And during the construction, there was a lot of various things that we had a storm come up one night, and we had doors in place and no roof on it, and Albert and I found ourselves both out there trying to take out doors and get them covered up and stuff like that. He didn't call me, I didn't call him, we just both showed up, and it was a strange relationship with Albert. It was kind of an interesting one. He was left-handed, and I'm right-handed, and always teasing each other about it. But when we worked on a building, you could work into a corner, and the guy on the right hand with the right hand could take the right hand side, and the guy on the left hand could take the left hand side, and nails in and stuff so much easier. And there's a lot of things that happen like that. But we continued to have services, and of course we didn't have the great big number that we did that first time, but we still ran 60, 70 people before we got the building, out of the community building. But one of the incidents that happened along there early in that building, there was one of the pastors, Brother Reed, was working out there with some of the construction, and there was a couple of Indian boys came by. One great big old boy, and the other one kind of average size, and so they were standing around there, and Brother Reed took his hammer and he threw it over at one of these boys, and he says, "Why don't you boys get to work and help build this?" And come find out, it was Roy Hallingwater, and won't get his name here for a minute, but I will. But anyway, they later told me, they said, we picked up a hammer and we worked for a little while, just to get them off our back, and but they stayed till lunchtime, and the First Baptist Church women provide lunch for the hands. So Frank Roby was this other boy's name, and so they went down and ate dinner, and of course they ate healthy. They really waded in, and they got tickled at old Frank. And Frank said, they offered him another piece of pie or something, and he said, my eyes are still hungry, but my stomach is full. But these two guys showed up the next day, and they started working on this, and they stayed, and they got to come into church, and come to find out, they were a part of a gang of pretty rough kids. Roy was the leader of it, and they came off and on to church, and helped on the building, and eventually we led 8 out of the 9 members of this gang to the Lord, and Roy and both became Christians. And as time went on, Roy surrendered to preach, and later he went to Clear Creek Baptist School in Pineville, Kentucky. Now, I had made, in my World Mission Conferences, I had been in that area, and knew some of the people that were there, and so made arrangements where Roy could go to school there, and so he went to school at Clear Creek, and eventually, well, I guess might as well just finish Roy's story out. Roy went to school down there, and he went for 3 or 4 years, and the tuition was paid, and everything was paid, and he began to see being a preacher, an Indian preacher down there, among those white churches. They began to pay him, and it began to spoil him. It began to be a paying proposition for him, and when he eventually graduated and came back to Hammon, he was not. He was real critical of the Indian people. He had become almost white in a lot of his thinking, and but he came back and got a job and was working at a filling station. Now, over this time, this took 6 or 7 years, but he got to working at a filling station, and one night there was a burglary, and he was killed. And they caught the guy that killed him, but he got out of they had him arrested, but not for his killing. But anyway, he got out and he got into another state, and he got caught. And but eventually, they were at a point where they could, when his prison sentence on the other crime was done, they were going to be able to bring him back in and try him for Roy's death. But it was strange that this happened, and yet this helped bring our Hammon Indian mission back to the Lord as we saw God working through this thing, even though it was the loss of Roy. And it was he was just a neat fellow, but we need to be careful. We need to be careful when we work with Native American people as ministers, that we help them to where that they will be able to work back among their people.
Right.
And this tragedy, even what it was, brought me to a realization that we really need to be more careful as we work with them. And we saw the ministry there among these folks grow. We finished the church building and moved into it. It was a beautiful work, and the people began to come. We'd run 60, 70 people in our services. It was when we came to business meetings, it was so neat. If I had an idea, I'd throw that idea out, and then they would talk in Cheyenne with one another and make a decision, and then one of them would come back and say, yeah, preacher, we're going to go with this, or no, that's not a good idea, or whatever. And I had been there for several years and had picked up a little of the Cheyenne and understood. And I'd thrown something out one night, and they were discussing it, and I realized that what I was picking up was they'd misunderstood what I was saying. Mm-hmm. And I said, no. And I mean, it got dead still. And they kind of looked at one another. And from then on, our business meetings were in English.
No. They figured out that you were
yeah, that I was understanding, and so they were in English. But this was a time when our kids were growing up, and our church was growing. We were there a little over 8 years, and we saw. As I mentioned earlier, we were involved in Royal Ambassador work. We were involved in Indian Falls Creek. We had an associational camp down 75, 80 miles south of us, at what they call Lugert, and on a lake down there, and our young people were involved in that, and we did Royal Ambassador Association Royal Ambassador camps, and there I am again with working with the Royal Ambassador camp. We had in our association we had a brotherhood boys and men's meeting once a year. Had a big steak fry, and we had a layman that had a big cook pot like I've got, and that's where I stole his idea. That big crock pot. If we could feed 150, 200 men and boys steak sandwiches, and as fast as they go through, and we'd have programs, and we'd split the programs. We'd have a men's session and a boys' session, and one of the laymen was a DeWitt Hawkins over at Durham Baptist Church, and he used to play with a guitar and sing, fantastically beautiful voice, and one of his favorites was On the Wings of the Snow White Dove, and he played for our boys and for our men, and we just Roy and Frank or Roby, those two guys would go to our RE camps and to our associational camps, and they were involved in them. We went one year and took a teepee, and we had the only television in the whole camp. We had our teepee set out in the middle of the campground, and when you turned the electric light on at night, you had instant TV. Made sure it wasn't clothes change in time. But those years that we spent there, among them, we saw many people come to the Lord. We saw Roy and the majority of his gang were saved. We had a WMU, we had a brotherhood, we had RAs, we had GAs, we had our regular Sunday morning, Sunday night, we had Wednesday night services. Our Indian people were scattered all through our community. It wasn't a segregated situation. They were pretty much scattered all the way through. And one of the unique things I taught on tithing, and we had a lady that her husband was not a Christian, and he would not allow her to give. She tried to tithe part of her money for grocery money, and he wouldn't allow any of it. So she got to where she would, whenever it was commodity time, she'd go get her commodities, and then on her way home she would come by and she would give Deloris and I the tithe of her commodities. And her husband's name was White Man, and I can't get a first name on her now, but we had the experience experiences that a pastor has as he watches his people grow, and we had our own vacation Bible school, our own workers for our vacation Bible school,